Nick Sands coming in from Delaware for now. Parts unknown, the world, to come visit with us. So appreciate that. We've got a couple of things we'll go through before I introduce Nick. Okay, there you go. That's all right. First off, we always like to thank our sponsors. So we have all of our sponsors here shown. They're on our website as well. If any of you would like to sponsor the section, it's $150 a year. And that helps us provide lunches for these meetings, gives us money to do some of our events that we support, FIRST Robotics and scholarships and things like that. So that it does help us. So we do appreciate our sponsors. Just to show a couple things going on here at events. Tomorrow we did have a intro to management of alarm systems session that was scheduled. We did not have enough attendees. So that was canceled several weeks ago. Just want to make sure everyone was aware of that, that is not going on. Nick was gracious enough, was going to teach that class for us, but we'll have to try that again some other time. We don't have a meeting set up for July yet. We've juggled a couple speakers that have been tentative, so I don't know. We'll see if we can nail that down this week, and if we can make it happen, we will. Otherwise, we'll just we'll skip July. In August, Paul Groon's going to come in, and he's going to do a kind of an ISA society update, and then also talk a little bit about S84, which he's intimately involved with. For those of you that don't know, Paul is the incoming president for the society. So January, I guess he'll pick up the role as president for ISA, and he'll have that role for the next year. Paul has also agreed to teach a class that week. So he does this EC50 Safety Instrumented Systems class for design analysis and justification. So we have that loaded on ISA's website. So if you go to isa.org, go to training, you can attend that class. That's a full week class. You see the price there is $36.38 for non-members, members $29.45. So that's worth the price of membership right there. You pay your $120 membership and get that reduced price for the class. This class, I'll give you a little bit of rundown on it. This is if you wanted to be a functional safety, work on your functional safety specialist program. You actually you go through the class, and then you're also registered to take the test. So you go through the class, take the test. If you pass the test, then you become a ISA certified functional specialist. Yes. Uh-huh. Did you take the test too? And did you pass the test? All right. Excellent. Good job, Art. So that's good. He's a great speaker, wonderful speaker. Yeah, very good. Any topic he talks about, he's very articulate and does a great job. So so anybody is looking for their safety certification, this would be a good opportunity to do it. So please, you can hit our website, and then you can link in to ISA's website and register. And but you'll see, the various things that you'll be able to do at the end of that course. These are the sections that are covered. Intros, safety layers, failure modes, technologies, design, maintenance. There's quite a few resources that you get with this. So there's a textbook that you'll get as part of the class. You'll get all the pertinent standards from ISA, hard copies as part of that class. Now, as you know, if you're a member of ISA, you can look at all these standards at no charge. That's in part of your membership, but you actually get hard copies of these standards as part of that class. So quite a bit of bang for your buck for that money for if you want to commit a full week of your time to getting your certification. And with that, I will turn it over to Nick. So, did I mess up? Oh, display settings. Yeah, gotcha. All right. All right. So we're very happy to have Nick here with us. Some of you may have heard Nick talk. He was our keynote speaker a couple of years ago at one of our honors and awards banquets, 2016. And he came and talked to us about standards and the importance of standards. And that was a very educational and entertaining topic, because he had to make sure it was tuned for spouses as well and didn't put anybody to sleep. So he did a wonderful job with that. And so Nick is the past vice president of standards and practices for ISA. His pay job, he works for DuPont as a senior fellow, driving out their standards and their competencies for the company, and travels the world helping solve problems for DuPont. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nick. And again, appreciate you coming out.
All right, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Coming through loud and clear. So thanks for the opportunity to come back. And I've been working in Laplace for most of the last 3 years. So I'm looking forward to coming to section meetings, and had a little gap there, but I'm glad you guys have everything back on track. Looks like a great program. Paul Gruen is an excellent speaker, to be sure. I was just checking. I thought the 3rd edition of his book was in the works. So I wasn't able to check that, but I thought it was. I do know that speaking of books, the 3rd edition of the Guide to the Automation Body of Knowledge just went to the printers last week. So that book, which is great for younger folks, when you have new folks coming in, that's a good book that kind of gives them a little chapters on every little topic that we have in automation. So I've been with DuPont for about 28 years and worked in professional development department of ISA on the Certified Automation Professional Program, CAP. Anybody CAP? Nope, not yet. All right. Future CAPs, I got you. And then spent a lot of time in standards. How many of y'all are involved with standards in ISA? All right. Which committee? 101. 101, fantastic. Yep. Good. So I was director for 101. I think I am co-director for 101 again. Co-chair of IS 18 on alarm management. Co-director of 84 on safety instrumented systems. And part of that is to be able to keep track of those boundaries and make sure that we know which committee should be talking about which subject, so they don't get them all cattywampus right there. And then within the IEC, working on alarm management as well. So I spend a lot of my time, this is all volunteer time pretty much, working on standards. Within DuPont, I also spend a lot of time working on our corporate standards and trying to keep them straight, both our process safety management standards and also our safety system alarm management and some of our other standards as well. So one of those people that we're over in London working at our design office there for a project we're building in Luxembourg. And everybody's like, oh, what are you going to do this weekend? And I'm like, well, I'm going to do some standards because that's what I have to do right now. You can't set, you're on the committee and comments are due or you have to resolve them or whatever. And so it's really my hobby. And that could make me sound like a pretty boring person. I'll take it. But I've enjoyed the people I've gotten to meet through standards. And I believe it really has opened up a lot of doors through the way. What I'm going to talk to you a little bit about is, framing what ISA does around standards and the opportunities that you have there. And then maybe a little bit of a quiz to see which ones you recognize, which ones you might have been using. And hopefully through that process, then we'll cover some ground on where the standards are today and where they're going. What's currently the high levels of activity in standards in ISA and where that might take us in the next few years. Does that sound all right? Okay, good. So 1945, ISA gets founded. It was a whole bunch of different instrument societies. I don't think Wilmington, Delaware, which is where I used to have a house, but I don't anymore. I think 1949, we got our charter. I don't know when New Orleans section got their charter. 1945. So one of the original founding charter sections of ISA. It's tough to find that if you don't go to each section and ask it. And one of the first things that group did, and they would have hundreds of people at those first conferences, one of the first things that they did was say, hey, what we should really work on is some kind of common language and symbology for us to describe our instruments and put them on diagrams of the process, right? So flow plan symbols was one of the first ones. Recommended practice, RP 5.1. So It has evolved into ISA 5.1, our current standard for symbology, right? Which is used widely around the world, not just in the US. There's parts of Europe that don't like to use it much, but that symbology's been out there for a long time and is very widely used. Even for that project we're working on in Luxembourg, they're like, okay, here's an instrument spec sheet. I'm like, what's this based off of? Well, ISA 20, right? So those instrument spec sheets are used around the world as well. So that's good. That helps us communicate. Just like if we're using any other protocol, Ethernet or RS-232 or RS-45, there's a standard that says, how are we going to communicate on both sides of that, receive a signal and send a signal. And that's what a lot of these standards allow us to do, is to communicate with each other. So today, ISA is a standards development organization accredited by ANSI. We get audited every year then by ANSI. So an interesting thing there. Audited every year by ANSI to make sure we're following their procedures. And that's good. They help keep us straight from all the other standards development organizations. So what does that mean? They kind of manage the landscape. When we started a new ISA standard on alarm management, 2003, we had to file a document to ANSI, and then they send that out, and then UL comes back and says, hey, we already have a standard for building security alarms and fire alarms, and you can't go into that space. That's our space, right? So that's where these boundaries come up. You'll even see in that standard, which I'm not going to tell you the number yet, that there's an exclusion at the beginning that it excludes those fire alarm and building security alarms, because that's our agreement with ANSI when they manage that landscape. Thousands of people spend their volunteer time or the company sends them to participate in those standard committees, and we have hundreds of them that meet. That's the main committees and the working groups. So working groups 1 and 2 on the ISA 101 that are working on technical reports that will help us there. So it's been a big part of ISA for a long time. And how many of you have used standards, reference standards, looked at them? Pretty much everybody. Okay, yeah. So it's important. ANSI coordinates us then into not only for making sure they manage that landscape within the US, but then ANSI coordinates our participation into IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission. So if you want to be on one of those standard committees, they are not open and to everybody like the ISA committees are. You have to be a registered member to go to an IEC committee meeting. And so you can't just walk in like you can for any of the ISA meetings. And there's none of these principles right here don't follow consensus, and balance and openness are not part of that IEC process. They don't have to have consensus. The convener can really say, I want it to be this way. And then each country submits a vote, and that's coordinated again through ANSI. So we have a US National Committee, and that US National Committee, for example, here I mentioned TC65 within IEC. So we have a US National Committee for TC65, and that's how we coordinate our votes that we send into the IEC. So at the moment, I'm a Deputy Technical Advisor for Subcommittee 65A. So when we vote through IEC on the international version of ISA 84, IEC 61511 edition 2 for safety instrumented systems, that goes through Subcommittee 65A through our US National Committee and then to IEC. So there is a structure there that how we as a US standards group interface with the IEC, which has been around since 1906 and has around 6,000 standards and technical reports. And I think 62 countries represented and most of the world's population. So the stated mission for ISA when we develop a standard is to take that and move that into the IEC realm and have that become an international standard. Now, in part, that can take away your ability to view that as an ISA member. We'll get to that in a minute, but we're trying to preserve that with how we work with the IEC. But they are the big dog, and we're just the tail, so there's not too much we can do sometimes there. However, that's IEC in general. If we take the area of automation systems that typically falls into this TC 65A, Technical Committee 65, I'm sorry, 65. Most of the important standards that have come through TC 65 have come from ISA. I'm not going to tell you all the names because we're going to see a whole bunch of those as we go into the later part of the presentation. But ISA certainly has greatly influenced not just what we do here in the US, but the entire world when it comes to these standards around automation. And we continue to do so today. So as a member, you have a member benefit where you can call up those, you can't print them out. There was a brief period of time where you could print them out, but you can call up any standard you want by clicking on View Standards as a member benefit. How many people have done that? I do that fairly routinely. We'll have some conversation. I might even be on a conference call and something will come up. Well, what about a standard for this? Instrument air quality, or what's one I looked up the other day? Installation and maintenance of gas detectors in a hazardous location. So the different standards like that. So if you're going and you want to find a standard, by the way, to the ISA website, I recommend, if you know what it is, that you go to Google and you put in isa.org space standard 5.1 or something like that, right? And that'll take you right to a page, and you'll have to sign in, and then you can use your member benefit. But the worst way to try to find anything is to try to go to that website. It's terrible. It's terrible. So, but if you know what you're looking for a little bit better, you can put some keywords in there, and you go to isa.org and Google, go to isa.org and then put in that, it'll take you right to the page that you need to go to. So I never navigate through here. I'll just navigate using Google through that mess. But so you can view lots of standards. If we have a standard like IEC 61511, so this is on safety instrumented systems. How many of you have to deal with that standard ever? Okay, so several of us. So you might be taking Paul Grun's class if you haven't already taken it, right? So that standard, and if you've taken that class, so you probably know that history. You may know it anyway. That was ISA 84.00.01-1996. And then it was submitted to the IEC as a standard. And when it goes through that IEC process, when it came out on the other side, it was IEC 61511 and no longer had any copyright associated with ISA, even though the original version of that was written in the US. So we've had several standards that have gone that way. And so even though the first version of this standard was written through ISA members no longer have the viewing rights for that. However, it just finished edition 2, came out in 2016 with an addendum in 2017, and the maintenance committee for this standard kicked off already 2-3 weeks ago in Italy. So they're starting a new round of maintenance on the standard already with a partnering agreement with ISA. So it might be co-published with ISA when it comes out, and restoring free access rights to ISA members is what we're hoping out of that. So sometimes we try to do that. It's a deliberate policy statement from the Standards and Practices Board that we don't submit our technical reports to IEC because we don't want to lose the member benefit of free viewing of those. We'll send the standards there because the technical reports can't have any requirements, right? They can explain a requirement, but they can't have any requirements. So the standards then have the requirements. They get submitted. We can have the same requirements globally. That's our goal, make it easy to do the same project the same way in more than one country. The technical reports can explain how to accomplish that. If the standards are the what you have to do, the technical reports might be more of the how you can go about doing it, one way of doing it. And so then we keep those within ISA so that those are there. And there's a whole bunch of, for example, under the ISA 84 committee, I think they have 8 technical reports that you can look at. So member benefit there. Also, it's ISA members and non-members that write these standards. So if you think that there should be some things that should be fixed, the language isn't clear, you'd like some, something else added in there, the way to do that is join. It's free. It does not cost anything. You don't even have to be an ISA member to be on a standard committee. Although as a committee chair, I will talk to everybody twice a year at our face-to-face meetings and say, it's like stealing NPR, right? If you really find value in this, then you ought to, pay a membership so that you're supporting the business that then publishes all those. There's a lot of overhead costs, the audit from ANSI, the procedures, the things that we have to do to be able to meet those requirements. Most of the meetings are by conference call. Most of the work is done, they email out or have a SharePoint for the Word document, and then you turn in an Excel spreadsheet with comments, and then they all get addressed. You participate by calls to get in there. And if you want to develop a subject matter expertise, this is the way you do it, right? You're sitting in there talking to people who are the world's experts on that little piece of automation, right? Not all of it, but on that little piece. So when Paul Gruen talks, he's a world-class expert on safety instrumented systems, to be sure. He's now the co-chair of the ISA 84 committee as well. So just a couple of years ago, we put him in as the co-chair there. There's lots of people I have met. I've learned so much. When I go to one of these ISA leader meetings and I'll just pop in on, I have nothing else on my calendar. Okay, I'll sit in on a standard committee that I don't know that much about. And there's plenty of them. And then I'll learn a whole bunch of stuff from people that really have a high level of expertise. Some of them I've eventually gotten to be, where I can contribute a lot to them, but a lot of them I'm still learning. That doesn't mean you can't participate. You don't have to join a standard committee because you are a world-class expert. If you think about developing world-class expertise, how do you do that? Well, I'll just sit in my office and I'll just do my own thing. No, it's out there interacting with other people that have that kind of level of knowledge, and you can grow and become one of those world-class experts. It's a great career development element, right? To be able to do that. So there's a link on the website. You can also Google isa.org, join a committee, and boom, it'll take you right to the page, and you can say, I want to join this committee. Then you're going to have to say whether you're a user or an integrator or a government, that we have to track what the composition of the committee is. That's part of that balance requirements that come back from ANSI. So you can see them, you can join them. Let's see how you use them. So here's some of our more popular, and when we did some metrics a couple of years ago, last year, really there was a top 5 that showed up in 3 different ways, the same top 5, and they're going to be in here, but those same top 5, whether we were looking at what we sold, that most of the standards are sold through IHS at the moment, right? So a company will buy a subscription to IHS, and then you choose what you want in that library, and you have access to it. That's how we access these standards in DuPont as well. What do people view on the website? And what do we sell separately? So all of those, really, it's just a mixture of the order, but it's the same top 5 that are in here as we go through. So first off, standards that you might be using right now. We saw 84. What else? 18.2. That's a good one. Thank you. Any other good ones? 5.1 we talked about, symbology. ISA 20 series on instrument spec forms, maybe. 101. There's not a lot of requirements in 101, but it's a mind-changing framework around how you do your HMI development, right? So, and maintenance. And 101. Anybody else on the committee? Not even as an informational member right now? All right, that's a great thing for you to do today, right? All you have to do is go in and log in today and join a standard committee, whichever one is your favorite. All right, so now it's going to be a little bit of a quiz. I'm going to show you some iconic image representing the concepts that are embedded in those standards and see if you can tell me which one it is, and then we'll make sure we talk a little bit about those concepts as well. Yay, it's 5.1. Yeah. So it's been updated. It has, heart. There's a wireless transmission symbology field bus. So they keep this standard up to date. Every 5 years or so, it gets updated, and there's little tricks that come in there. I get questions periodically about how to represent this, and I cheat and I go to Tom McAvenue, who was one of the chairs, and so he knows a lot about that symbology. He's retired, working out in living out in Colorado still, but he'll answer me back, well, this is how I would do that, right? So it's a great thing to know, the people that were on that committee, when you want to find somebody comes up and says, how would you put this on a drawing? Well, I'm not really sure, but I know who to ask, right? And that's a key thing there. So, but that really helped us, you understand what all those things are, right? So it's great. Some of it's a little bit archaic in a way. What's the box mean? Those of you who PEs, what's it? Yeah, it's the primary panel too, right? It's on the front of the primary panel. There's symbology for being on the secondary panel, being on the back side of the front, but it's all in DCS systems now, or PLC systems mostly now. But most of that, all that symbology was developed when it was all panels. There was no field bus or Profibus, right? So, but it preserves that functionality going forward. Yep. This is the colorized version of the black and white film on alarm management. ISA 18.2, right? So this is one I've spent personally tens of thousands of hours working on. It's one thing to participate. You can participate in a standards committee actively and contribute for 40 hours a year or less, 20 hours a year maybe, right? But you cannot chair a committee for 40 hours a year. And if you're developing a new standard like that, it can take whoever's the chair, that's the driving force. That's what makes it all happen. So it can take a long time. But these, we have several of these standards now that have a life cycle that has become the kind of the summary, the icon, if you will, that when you see that image, if you've taken any kind of training on that alarm management, it brings to mind everything that you need to do to complete all the activities for managing an alarm system. It's all summarized in a little diagram like that. So, and it's actually been updated with a few more lines on it. It's just an aside there. If you go through a process like this, there were probably 700 comments during the 5 years of development on how to draw that, whether these should be numbers or letters, and the arrows should be double-headed or not, and the boxes, that's the kind of comments you sometimes get. But ISA 18.2 for sure. What about this one? ISA 84, IEC 61511. When it comes back out, it'll still be the ISA 84 committee, but they voted, that vote closed earlier this year, to make this edition 2 of IEC 61511 the new ANSI standard for safety instrument and systems. So there's some new requirements that are in there, things that we're going to have to do that we didn't quite have to do before. I wouldn't say there's a whole lot. There's a couple of them that are a little bit of a pain. Some documentation, FSAs on operation and maintenance timeframe, some things like that. But it should come out as ISA 61511. So we're changing our numbering strategy, that if we adopt the IEC standard, that the numbering will be the same. So the committee won't be the same, but the number of the standard will be the same. So you'll see it as ISA 61511 parts 1, 2, and 3. There's a part 0 as well.
Now the technical reports will those still
They will. The technical reports 1 through 8, and then there's also there's an old one on TR 91 that can't be updated, and then there's an 8491 TR as well. So there's a number that are within that. And the work in ISA, the 84 committee right now, is they're going to start up a couple of working groups again to go back over wireless, update their wireless report, the burn management report. So those two working groups would kick back in there. That's on technical reports. The, the big activity in terms of standard is there's a joint working group. They started down a path of writing a standard that would provide requirements for all of the instrumented systems that we use for protection against safety hazards. And a big part of that, though, was they were overlapping with the ISA 18 committee. So there is a joint working group that is working on a new US standard that will talk about the requirements that come into play for interlocks that aren't SIFs and alarms that are used for protection for safety. And we can debate, and I would, how necessary some of that is, but certainly there's an area that needs to be clarified, and the joint working group is tasked with doing that. So this life cycle again, iconic. If you have been trained on safety instrumented systems, and those boxes remind you of all the things that you have to do to complete the life cycle, right? So that's, it won't have this number the next time it's issued, which should be within the next month, I want to say. Should be within the next month. Yep. And the way that works, if you're curious, is it came through IEC, and then just like, so if it's adopted in the UK, it goes through the British Standards Institute, and then they vote to adopt it. And if there's any country modifications that they'll make, then they'll scratch out you'll see strike through on the text, and then a new text inserted for what their country requirement would be. So we added, the first time it came through, the grandfather clause that said if we had designed that system with standards that were prior to this one, we don't have to redesign it, but we still have to do all the operational and maintenance activities to keep it, operating safely. So that was incorporated into the IEC version this time around. They're like, that's a good idea. So there it is. About this one for batch. It is ISA 88. So that committee, sometimes they named them after the years, and I say it started in 88, and it didn't publish the standard till 96, took about 8 years. Not ISA 84 took 12. Sometimes when you start up those first committees, I think it took 7 for 101, it took 5 for 18. Some of those can take a while to develop, but before this standard came out, what you meant by operation or phase or even batch varied by the system that you used. Their initial goal with this particular part of the standard, part 1, was to set down terminology and provide once and for all a global definition and models about how those things would run together. And so they did this fantastic work of saying there's equipment, and that equipment doesn't define what we make. We have a recipe that tells us, and a procedure that tells us how we're going to use that equipment to do that, right? So by separating those, that procedural model separate from the equipment model, and then they wanted to focus on reusability, and that was fantastic. So it changed everything about how batch is developed, automated, and even run. And they continue, they updated, tweaked the definitions a couple of years ago. So they continue to do that for sure. But part 1, models and terminology, there's a couple of other standards that have done that same kind of thing following that model of the ISA 88, which was so successful. It's adopted by IEC. It maintained now by MESA. The World Batch Forum was maintaining it. And well, we still, ISA has the committee because we're the standards development organization. But they play a lot of, have a lot of influence on that. All right, this one. This is a pretty influential one. What? 95? It is the ISA 95 model, right? So this is control system integration to manufacturing and enterprise systems. There's a lot of work going on in this area now, because the models that they have here turn out to be very relevant for IIoT, the Industrial Internet of Things, and how do you take data up to different levels and process it and send information reports and analytics to other people. So there's work going on. So they defined the stuff here and the transitions there, but not down to this area here. And now there's work going on to model some of the activities down here in the same way. And that's going to help with the defining IoT and something else that we'll talk about at the end as well. So I work in this area because I've got some systems like for alarm management. I collect the alarms, I get that data up here. We have a cloud enterprise system for alarm data in DuPont. So hundreds of plants, all of their data comes up. And we have servers that run the analysis down there and send reports back down to all the sites. But all that data is brought up at that level, and we can give performance metrics that we can compare from site to site, things like that. So I think it is relevant to cloud computing, to the IoT, all those kind of things, those models. One of the things that, if you talk to, say, Dennis Brandel, one of the very influential people behind this is not supposed to be physical. It's a functional model, and some people get hung up on it's being physical. So that was not their intent. And what we see is certain functions are on a server here, but you would say it takes place up there. So it's confusing, and you can have one server do a function that's here and a function that's here on that, right? So it's not a physical model. I think that would be a key point he'd want me to stress. Zones and conduits, right? Obviously talking about electrical safety, or are we? It is. It's a 62443 standards from the ISA 99 committee. So this is a case where when we started to do this, ISA 99 committee was formed, and they had such a need in IEC, we had a co-publish agreement from day one. So we have co-publish agreements right now on ISA 95 and ISA 99, where we can write those, and then they're still available to ISA members to view because we're co-publishing. So what happens from a revenue standpoint is if it's issued as an IEC standard, nobody buys it from ISA, right? So we don't get any revenue really back from that, except for IEC is so slow, we get like 4 months head start on them, and we can get the same standard out there earlier. So sometimes we get it. If people don't want the physical copies, but if you're buying a subscription, you're not going to do it. And that is, here we're going to define security zones. So I was just doing a functional safety assessment last week, trying to define zone 0, what we call for the safety instrumented system, and what were the conduits that they had where there could be connectivity from zone 1, the control system, into that and cause a vulnerability. And so there are certain things we decided had to be done in order to protect that safety system from that. When we talk to DHS, I don't know how many of you have to talk to DHS about your cybersecurity program, but the threat vector that they insist that we have a policy to protect against is that somebody grabs the children of a control engineer and has them at gunpoint at their house and says, I need you to remote in and disable that safety system and cause an explosion. And so there has to be some way to prevent that from happening. So we don't allow any remote access to the safety system, and we don't allow any remote access to a system that could access the safety system. So those are the kind of things we have to build in as a result of that. So the zones and conduits are a very useful model for trying to frame that up. All right, ISA 101, very useful for us. This part right here was pretty much very useful to system standards to be able to go in and say, let's have a philosophy. And sometimes we collapse this in our style guide as part of that philosophy. And then the toolkit concept for us, where we have a toolkit manager. So we buy a system from, say, brand H, right? And it comes with this huge library of shapes that we can drop down onto displays. And our first exercise to go in there, thinking about our style guide, and we select the 7 that we will use or the 14 that we will use, they go in our toolkit. And we don't ever go back to that big library. We always use that toolkit until somebody comes up with something that they can't find something in the toolkit for, and then we go back and the manager for the toolkit goes back to that style guide. We have a discussion, we pick that, and it goes onto the toolkit. And if you have 5 people working on displays for a process and you want to make sure they look like only one person ever touched them, then you have to have some kind of process for managing it like that. And at our sites, we used to have that and we had lost it. And so this framework coming in now has really helped us reestablish that. Let's manage these systems consistently over time for many years. And we see the benefits in through the operator. So just that part right there has really helped us get things back on track. So there's a couple working groups there working on the philosophy, the TR, the performance TR, and then the mobility, I think, is the next one that's supposed to come up. So, what about this one? This is one of the ones I think is really powerful. It's an extension of ISA 88 to continuous processes. So startup and shutdown of, startup and shutdown of the continuous processes, or if you have to back flush something and you want to automate that sequence, or defrost a crystallizer, or blow down a piece of equipment, then following this is a good way to go about doing that. And their terminology is a little bit different. They said, well, why can't you just use the same terminology we used in 88? And they're like, well, because our terminology is a little bit different. So, but it's not inconsistent in structure. So that's a good thing. So that's ISA 106 procedural automation. And that's very interesting. So some of the guys from Dow are leading that. They've done quite a good job of automatically starting up their plants, automatically shutting down their plants. They have a big integrated facility, and they can tell you to the minute how long it takes for the 5th unit in a train to start up, because they have it down like that. So it's pretty impressive. This is the big one too. Anybody sell any heart instruments? Yeah. ISA 108 committee, Intelligent Device Management. Herman Story leading this one with Koji Damash from Yokogawa in Japan. And what's the process? So if you go out and buy all those smart instruments, or you have all these hard IO cards, and now you're getting, or you have Fieldbus and you have all this stuff coming in as well through that, you have all this information around these instruments and diagnostics, all that, and you get overwhelmed with a whole bunch of messages that are completely meaningless. This bit has flipped, it's flipped back, it's flipped, it's flipped back, it's flipped, it's flipped back. I mean, I throw away hundreds of thousands of those messages a day through some of our control systems. I filter all that stuff out because I don't want to go into my alarm servers, right? Why? Because we didn't have any work process that first set those devices up and said, what messages do we want it to send? So the Nomura 107 group talks about these classification of the messages, and they're working closely with the ISA 108 committee on what's this work process for doing some of these things, so that in the end, you can get the real valuable messages out of that. So if that's an area that interests you, there's still work going on in that ISA 108. They did a TR to start with, models and terminology. And now they're working on a standard and a framework. And I have to say, I was not happy to see some of the requirements that were in the draft, but they're draft. So I think I will have to play a more active role in reviewing and commenting, just to make sure there's not something that pops up in there that I don't want to have to live with. So that's part of it, right? Is just say, whoa, 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 that's a little bit much. Can't that just be a recommendation, not a requirement?
So this is a case where a TR came before the standard, or does that happen often? TRs and RPs coming before standard? So
there a couple of these committees have done this, where they did a TR part 1, models and terminology. And the reason why they changed that from a standard to a TR was because they didn't have any shall requirements in there. So it's a different interpretation of the requirements around the threshold for a standard. So if you go through the IEC directive, the standard would have normative statements. However, what should, shall, must, may, mandatory normative statements are shall statements, non-mandatory or should or may. But the definition section is supposed to be normative. So that leaves you, well, if the definition is normative and then it's normative content, then it can be a standard. So they could have gone either way. So some of them said, well, we don't have any shalls through the rest of it because it's all about how do you do this. But they could have, ISA 88.01 was models and terminology, no shall statements in there. But if you're going to apply the framework, the terminology and the models are all required. And so you can view it different ways. So some people have gone in and said, okay, we're going to do it as a TR. And some people said, we're going to do it as a standard. So it all gets to do with this. If you spend enough time in standards, you start to pay attention to the process and the guidelines for the process about how they're made to make sure that that's effective in the results. And the rest of the world gets bored out of their mind as soon as I start talking about that. So any questions so far or comments? So I think I've told you a little bit about where things are going. This is a hot topic, by the way. This is an IEC right now, 108. I think we're going to co-publish that. Some of those, I can't remember which ones go. SC65A, SC65B, SC65C, and SC65E. I think the D is the one that's not there. But, so there's a lot of talk about a couple things, and the Internet of Things or the industrial Internet of Things, and how that might affect automation systems, how it might affect supply chains, how it might affect buildings and plants and homes and all those kind of things. And where does ISA fit into all that? And we have had a technology search committee that has been looking at that. What specifically can ISA do in this area? And so they're looking to parse it out. The first thing, if you're going to have a conversation about IIoT, is what does it mean? And it means different things to different people, but it's hard to boil it down to something that's concrete, that is something that we haven't already been doing. Well, we're going to have a sensor somewhere and we're going to send the data somewhere else. So what? Right? So, well, how it gets sent and where it gets sent and what layers it goes through, all those can matter, and what protocols we use. So, well, we could use OPC to send that data around, and we could. But if you've worked with OPC, that is not a compact protocol, right? So that's, like tons of fields in there to send a small message sometimes. So there's that. There's an effort right now where we talk about these different supply chains, production, operation, and zero in on the operating part in the factory of the life cycle. If we took all of those different life cycles we looked at and put the operation and maintain part overlapping, what will we do there? And so that's an area that we're working on now. It's a special team within the Standards and Practices Board to try to map the activities that would allow the data and actions to be diagrammed for all the things that happen and operate and maintain. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is what they think will help us be able to determine exactly where there's opportunities for the IIoT. The second thing that I think will come out of that is the potential for application in the open systems group. You all heard about this? The PLC Open, but this is the effort that Exxon kicked off, right? To say we don't ever want to have to do all of our control system upgrades. We want everything to be interchangeable from now until forever. And so they've had a number of companies working with them. Some of them have dropped out after working with them, but there's constantly all these people that are involved in some of these standards. They're constantly going all over the world for these meetings to be able to participate in this and draw out what the next deliverable has to be for them to, within 5 years or something, have a set of hardware that does what they're talking about. And part of that is, what standards do we have, and which ones might require modification to include further discussion of the activities, where data has to go, or standardization of those activities, so that the system could be built to a set of standards that would say, no one's asked for this yet, but say, have a standard set of alarm priorities. And it wouldn't be, if you were going to comply to that standard, then everybody in the world would then change to that set of priorities, and you wouldn't have one set from one vendor and one set from another vendor and one set from another vendor. Is that necessary? I don't know. If you're trying to standardize the world, then you would want to do that. I am not a standardize the world kind of guy. I'm separated into, do I have to, and then can I, right? Kind of thing. But there are certainly discussions going in there. So the open group isn't an SDO, so they aren't audited and don't have the authority to write standards. But ISA is, and ISA is the most productive automation SDO in the world. And so if there's standards to be developed in support of that effort, then they're looking at, how does that, can ISA do that? The potential there is for us to get caught up in the Third World War, right? The first one was field bus. The second one was, come on, people, you lived through it, the wireless wars, right? So where ISA was writing a standard that got into what hardware requirements had to be there, then the vendors were going after each other and didn't want a consensus standard to determine what their functionality had to be. They wanted to get their devices out into the marketplace first and let a standard become adopted by adopting what they had released into the wild, right? And then that's how they wanted it to be. So some of those things got really nasty. I was the managing director for a few years for the ISA 100 committee. And my job was to go in there and tell people if they couldn't behave in the meetings, they would be removed from the committee. And there's lots of nasty politics between people and whatever. Do I know anything about wireless? No. My job as the director was just to make sure people followed the rules of developing the standards, not that the technical content. So I think we'll see a lot of this in the world to come. And the cybersecurity, I think we'll see more of that. So certainly it's having an impact on safety systems. There is a new working group that's being formed to look at the cybersecurity of instruments. So there are those that are super concerned that the attack could come through the instrument and fake the signal and then go up, shut plants down, make people respond to things. So wireless instruments certainly could have that, but other ones, right? So there's a standard in development for taking your twisted pair and replacing your IO card with an Ethernet board and Ethernet over twisted pair, and then replacing your transmitters with Ethernet devices, all Ethernet plant. And what's your cybersecurity risks in an environment like that? So when we talk about this IoT, all those devices are connected via usually some wireless network, like whether it's Bluetooth or Zigbee or Wi-Fi or whatever. And then, so how much is that cyber threat at the instrument? And then one of the standards committees I found myself in is through the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, AAMI, and they work on the medical devices. The big powerhouse in that area is the FDA that approves the devices to be used. Their interesting approach to alarm management is the device has to be certified, and they do nothing at the system level. And I'm like, so we wrote some papers together about how you need to be able to look at the system level. You can't just look at the device level to be able to solve those problems. It's what the overall, you'll break the nurse, right? But a lot of those installations turn out can be at home medical, or these small facilities. And so what's the cyber protection for those devices? And then when you start talking about medical, you start talking about very sensitive personal information. And what's the cybersecurity to protect all of that, right? So there's a lot of interesting areas, but I would say that interconnectivity and the security of that information, that's the big direction. The open systems, the remapping of some of our traditional activities in a new framework. But those are probably areas out there. So if you've got some years left in automation and you want to do something interesting and exciting, there's plenty of committees where you can join. So, because in the end, we want to say, yeah, we've got a standard for that. It may not all be requirements. So you can access them, isa.org, and then put in the standard number that you're looking for, and you can join them. It's free. You're always welcome. We won't turn anybody away. We may not accept may not adopt your proposed changes, but we won't send you away. And it's likely that you can contribute as well. The very last draft of the IS-18 standard, there was somebody from Brazil that joined the committee and said, hey, I think we should change this. And we looked at it and went, damn, how did we miss that before? Right? So we had been looking at that for 4 years, and then he comes out of nowhere and says, this right here could be different. I'm like, all right, so accepted, right? So lasting impression on the standard coming in even at the last minute. So you can do that too. So thank you. Any comments or questions? It's mighty quiet in here. How about on the line? They're quiet there too. Huh? So we don't have a stand committee on IoT in ISA. There's about 100 different groups working on 100 different standards on IIoT around the world. A lot of it in Germany through their smart manufacturing 4.0. There's a whole bunch of names for all that stuff, and there's all kinds of groups that are working on it. So I can't answer your question directly, but I'm gonna say most likely the probability is yes. Yeah. Especially when we talk about even factory facilities or home equipment, things like that. Yeah. So,
kind of a mundane question, but I'm just curious, how big of a business is this standards business for ISA? And I'm assuming it's publicly available.
how much revenue?
Yeah, I mean, is it 100,000?
It's
$10?
It's around $200,000, I think, a year that we bring in from standards. It's enough to pay. We essentially make a little bit of money so the way that a lot of that stuff works for publications, for training, for standards, those are our big revenue generators. We typically don't make too much on the conferences anymore, but those revenue generators essentially defer most of the cost of membership from the society. So every time they break even and make a little profit, it reduces how much we need to pay as members to keep the society from losing money.
But most of the cost of developing standards is actually just paid for by the people on the committees or their companies.
Yes, most of the costs for developing this, so like my time is not paid for by ISA, but there's staff people that are paid for at ISA, right? They're the ones that take care of all the actual acts of publishing, some technical editing, the work with ANSI, all the other things that we have to do. So there is a cost definitely associated with that. And we cover that and make a little bit of money on top of it. Yeah. We used to not. We used to lose $600,000 a year on standards. And that's when we had Expo and it was covering all that loss. And so we don't have that loss anymore. We make a little bit of money on standards, but not a huge amount.
Yeah, I think I saw a metric at some point. I think training is #1 for ISA.
Training still
memberships
#1.
2,
Yeah.
Standards and publications, I think they're 3.
Yeah.
Something like that, as far as
So,
revenue generators.
Yep. So training is definitely, so like the training class, if we had it this week for alarm management, DuPont won't allow me to accept any money from ISA. So I take vacation. I do that. I donate my time to teach that. And I'm still willing to do it, right? Hardcore, man. Any other questions?
I have one, well,
Yes.
just maybe a comment on standards, kind of how standards are developed today in some of the communication mechanisms. I know the past was all face-to-face meetings and conference calls, but now, SharePoint, I've seen the SharePoint utilized in 101, and that seems very efficient. So have you seen anything as far as getting stuff out faster, more data, more input?
So the determining factor in how fast it gets done is the chairs of the working group or the committee.
Okay.
That is the dominant factor. The tools that we use are a smaller part in there. And so we've had technical reports with no SharePoint get issued in 6 months because
I was driving
the
it.
chairs are driving it, right? So, and then we've had things where we've had SharePoint and it took 5 years. So it's really a function of the leadership mostly. The tools are helpful, and we've had webinars within standards and practices to coach people on how to use SharePoint for their committees. So I run a committee effectiveness team within standards and practices that tries to say, what slows you down? How can we help you run your committee more effectively? And then we have training on those things. So,
yeah, I will put a plug in for that for being on a committee. So if you're on a committee, even as an informational member, you get free copies of reports in PDF form, that you can peruse and put comments on, and that's an extra added benefit.
Yep. And you go in there and if you want to join a standard committee and you want to contribute on the first draft to something that you look at, here's the trick. Start at the end, read that, and work your way to the front. Everybody that's on those committees starts all energetic. Well, I'm going to write comments. And then they go, oh, the first chapter, the clause, and this third clause. And by they get to clause 6, they're dead tired and they give up, right? And so the first half of those documents are usually pretty good. And the second half, nobody's even caught the misspelling, right? So you start at the end, you work your way back. People are like, these are good comments, man. I'm glad this guy's on the committee. Yeah. So there's easy ways to make a contribution. If just knowing how to, where's the weak spots, right? Yeah. And the weak spot is the end of the document, almost always. Yeah. So, all right. Well, thank you for the opportunity to come back and talk more about standards. I'll do it anytime.
Thanks, Nick. Really appreciate you coming out again. And with that, we'll just check your emails for a presence message and updates on if we have a meeting next month or not. We'll let you know. All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming out.